Have you ever heard of the Election Integrity Network? They authored the SAVE Act, and they're helping Trump erode guardrails in government and suppressing the college vote. We're going to talk today with our guest, Max Fluegraf, all about it. I'm Mallory Hagan.
And I'm Maggie Gelson-Burnett. This is Pretty Furious.
With Pepper in the background.
With Pepper's little snore.
Pepper is snoring. Pepper Ann, look at her. She's there.
I love having Pepper Ann. Is she flipped on her back?
She's just doing what dogs do.
Her legs
look at her. Oh, she said you're talking about me.
Oh my God, her face.
Pepper.
Amazing. Mallory.
Yeah.
Dude, my nervous system is fried after Tuesday.
I am unwell.
That was crazy.
I hosted the steaks last night with our dear friend Chad. And yes. I said, normally I can just like keep it moving. I am in freeze mode.
Yeah, fully. I agree. Yeah. I think a lot of people are. I think that we're all like at the point where, you know, it's shocking that we've made it this far, but our nervous systems are just in like fucking collapse. Like we're all just like,
especially millennials.
Oh my God. Like between 9/11, 2008, like everything from then on.
We're just
9/11 on has been a shit show.
By a thread.
Truly. But we do want to be sure that you're following us everywhere. We are at Pretty Furious Pod on every single platform you can possibly imagine. We host our podcast on Substack, so be sure to find us there. We are under the Siren Network. They have a lot of amazing content that's come out in the last week, especially since the shit show in Iran is taking place. So yeah, be sure to check them out as well. But yeah, before we get into our interview today, Mallory, do you have a headline that has made you pretty furious this week?
You know what? I do, actually. NPR has a business article that came out today, and the title of it is "Women Are Getting Most of the New Jobs. What's Going On with the Men?" And
who cares?
Literally, I don't care. But your dogs are chiming in that they do. This is just an episode where our animals are present.
Our animals are just joining. I'm so sorry.
That's just how it goes sometimes. But essentially this article, and I want to encourage people to read it, and we'll actually link it in the show notes because it's very fascinating. But it goes on to talk about like how men see professions that are typically dominated by women, and they just like don't want to be a part of them.
Fully,
And so we need to rebrand. We need to rebrand professions for men. I'm sorry, you mean the people who have been literally able to do anything that they want for all of eternity?
I'm sorry, did Scott Galloway write this article? He's like, the men are not okay.
The men are not okay. It was actually written by Andrea Hugh. I think that's how you would say her last name. And
woman wrote it. Wow, fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just really interesting. I don't know if it's making me furious so much as I'm just like,
yeah,
rebrand nursing and teaching. Get a life. How about don't gender roles? And like, this is the patriarchy hurts us all. Here you are, you can't get a job. And instead of just being a nurse, you're going, well, I don't want to be a nurse. That's for girls. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah. Ugh. What do you,
anyway,
exactly. Have you ever seen Romy and Michelle's high school reunion?
Absolutely.
Okay, I was going to say, if you haven't, then like we have really big problems. But like that Heather Mooney gif where she's like spitting out the beer at the reunion, that's literally what my face is doing.
Like, who cares?
Yeah.
Oh, hilarious.
My headline is from CNN this morning. It just says, Trump warns Iran that U.S. assault will intensify if deal not reached. I find U.S. assault being used as like a phrase in this headline very, very alarming. Please note that if you are ever listening to this podcast and I laugh while talking about an incredibly serious topic, that is my form of coping. That is how I cope. That is the only way to cope
on being uncomfortable.
Fully, all the time. So, yeah, certainly nothing to laugh about. I think earlier this week too, what we saw from Trump, where he, you know, was like doing this whole like abusive husband song and dance of like, you know, I saw that tweet that was like, what we just saw from Trump yesterday was him carrying around the gun in his house. Yeah. And like you hiding in the corner. That is exactly how he is doing all of this. He's acting like an abusive sociopath, which he is. But like, it's just like, you know, threatening these countries is not going to help anything. Like,
No,
this is
we
not
need diplomacy.
Yeah, like I explained to somebody earlier this week, I was like, threatening genocide is not a war strategy. Like this is not how we
No,
strategize when
and
we're
from a
thinking
strategy
about a
perspective,
conflict.
yeah, and from a strategy perspective, we've lost anyway. We've already lost.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, he's just, being his usual fuck ass loser self. So there you have it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and another thing that he's doing, because he is being his loser self, is looking for ways to make sure that people can't vote. We've been talking about the SAVE Act for over a year now because it was first introduced, what, last summer? Gosh, I don't even
Wow,
know
that
anymore.
is so crazy,
Hmm.
Mallory. We have been talking about the Save Act for over a year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
that's
keeps,
crazy.
bubbling up and down. But yeah, we've been
Hmm.
talking about the SAVE Act, and now there is an effort to suppress the college vote. And that effort is through the Election Integrity Network, which is a hilarious name for this organization that authored the SAVE Act and is working on what we're getting ready to talk to Max about. So I want to bring him in because I think you all are going to enjoy this conversation. Max Fluegraf is the communications director at Fair Fight. It's a nonprofit advocating for voting rights, and he's also a political strategist. So he's worked on campaigns in Georgia and Florida. He's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to voter access and voting rights, and I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with him today. So let's bring him in. All right, Max, thanks for joining us. We're glad you're here. What headline has made you pretty furious this week?
Thanks so much for having me. I don't remember verbatim, but NPR came out with a big story showing how Trump officials are trying to suppress the college vote right before the midterms.
Mm. College students are typically a demographic that I think a lot of people overlook because they're unreliable, or at least that's the story that we're told.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, so this program actually has actually helped increase student turnout. So it's a nonpartisan program that looks at sort of student engagement broadly at over 1,000 campuses, and they helped increase student turnout from 39% in 2016 to 47% in 2024.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
That's amazing. Yeah. So, something I'm curious about, Max, with when we talk about suppressing the college vote, like I think a lot of people assume that, again, to Mallory's point, college kids don't care about voting. They're not interested in it. They're not interested in politics, more broadly speaking, civic engagement. What we've seen from the last election is that Gen Z is actually kind of leaning more conservative in terms of their voting behaviors. Why do you think that is? I mean, I have my own speculations, but like you work in this department, so I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, right? I have my own thoughts and point of view. I guess I would venture that this is a generation that's grown up more on screens than us millennials. And, especially in the past couple of years, we've sort of seen this propaganda apparatus just strengthen and get bigger and bigger. So, I'm sure you're very familiar with what happened to Twitter, how Elon has changed the algorithms there to boost right-wing content. There's actually been a couple of academic studies showing that it does have an effect of dragging people more to the right.
Hmm.
Meta has also sort of been messing with their algorithms around political content, and now TikTok is the latest. I've heard a lot of reports of suppression and sort of right-wing content being boosted in that too. So young people have sort of grown up with these algorithms. And in the last couple of years, they have now been trending more to the right. Um, but, if you look at actually what's happening in the world right now, um, Trump's approval among college age voters is plummeting. And, I think it's because they are not seeing sort of what was sold to them in this propaganda apparatus in their everyday
Hmm.
lives. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably a good indication of why Trump officials are trying to suppress their votes in 2026.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting when you consider that the content is skewing right. So you would think that if they were doing their job on all these platforms, that Trump and them would be like, yeah, let's let the college kids vote. We've
Yeah, I was gonna say,
successfully
why
reached
suppress the
them.
vote?
Yeah,
Yeah.
why suppress it? So, and I do think you're right. I think they're looking around at their job prospects and the rent that they're facing, their healthcare options when they're bumped off their parents, and they're realizing, now, wait a minute, maybe getting married at 21 and popping out a bunch of babies without a job prospect or healthcare is probably not my best option. So I think there's some truth to that. When I ran for office in just my district in Alabama, there were 13 college campuses. And I
Wow.
consistently ran it. And I ran at 29. So I was trying to run as like, hey, I'm so close to your age. I'm one of you. Like, I get what you're going through. So many young people have no concept of how to vote, or
Mm.
they are not registered, and there's a lot of misinformation around like their ID, and voter ID laws are something else we'll get into, but their ID matching their address and all these things, right? They're just really confused by the apparatus of it all. What specifically is this administration trying to do in order to suppress college students this fall?
Yeah, so the NPR study builds on a previous story by the Huffington Post, the Huff Post, and essentially what they found was that the Department of Education sent these like letters to 1,000 plus colleges, sort of threatening them with loss of funding and sort of trying to like bully them into stopping engaging with this program, the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. Um, and essentially, what that program does is it looks at the voter turnout across 1,000 plus campuses and gives that information to the universities. Now, the universities probably look at that and they say, "Oh, only 20% of our student population is voting. Maybe we should, put up some signs reminding people the election's coming up, or distribute some information, maybe how to get registered to vote." So the program is not about who the college students are voting for. It's just about whether or not they are voting. And so the Department of Education is now leaning on colleges to stop engaging with this program. And so,
Mm.
connecting those dots, it seems like if the program isn't working as much, turnout will probably not be as high amongst college students at these 1,000 plus universities.
That's fascinating. Yeah, just to Mallory's point about like if Gen Z is leaning more conservative, then why is this administration doing so much to try to suppress their vote? Another thing that this administration is also actively trying to do in terms of voter suppression is the SAVE Act. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people view the SAVE Act, and especially in, circles that I've spoken with folks about it in, I think people view this as something that's like strictly hyperbole, like just kind of like this fun little threat that like the right is sort of, bringing about in legislation, and they're not really, it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to do anything. I would love to know your thoughts on like what can we expect when Congress comes back from the SAVE Act, and like why is this actually such a huge deal in terms of introducing this legislation in the first place, regardless of if it passes or not?
Yeah, well, they brought the SAVE Act up because they said that non-citizens have been voting all across the country and there's widespread election fraud. When you actually look at the data and the evidence behind those claims, they fall apart. It's not the truth. And so, you think about now sort of the latest on the SAVE Act, it's sort of faltered in the Senate, right? It's ground to a halt. They don't have the votes. They've been trying to work through sort of a convoluted process of changing the rules, which has also not worked. The next thing that I think we're going to see is they may try to attach certain aspects of the SAVE Act to the reconciliation sort of process, the bills that have to move through that in the Senate. It's a very specific, technical, convoluted, I think, process that has
Mhm.
to deal with funding. I know a lot of folks who are well versed in how Congress as a whole works are also kind of confused about this process. But that's how I think they'll try to move it through. You've also heard some Republican senators say that that plan seems impossible. So the path is sort of unclear. But, to your point about this might be like sort of a messaging bill and not a real thing, I don't think that's the right way to characterize it at all. I think if they could pass the SAVE Act, they would do it in a heartbeat.
Mhm.
And it's because it would suppress tens of millions of American citizens who are, legally eligible to vote. It would make it much harder for them to do so.
If they can't get the SAVE Act passed as a whole, which piece of it do you think that they would be most biting at the chomp for? Like if they have to break something off and start there, where do you think that they would go? I know this is just us pondering, but still.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, it seemed like before the Senate left, there was sort of a talk on the right about just focusing on the voter ID aspect of the SAVE Act. But then, again, if you take a step back and look at why they say they introduced the SAVE Act in the first place, which is because they falsely say there are large numbers of non citizens voting, a voter ID mechanism wouldn't really do much to combat that fake threat because most forms of ID don't have citizenship status included on them. And
Yeah.
so, then you kind of get back to the okay, well, if it's not going to address the actual problem that they say they needed to do when they introduced the bill, why are they doing it? And again,
Yep.
it just goes back to making it tougher. And one thing is about like the student aspect. Student IDs would not be an accepted form of ID.
Yeah. Voter ID laws, I think, would be the start, to your point, because that has probably the largest amount of support, potentially in a bipartisan way. I think there are many people who feel like, "What's the big deal?" And they'll throw that argument back at you. You have to have an ID to drive. You have to have an ID to, drink or whatever it might be. And so they kind of go, "Well, why shouldn't you have to have an ID to vote?" And being in Alabama, where we enacted voter ID laws, oh god, I can't remember the year, but I just remember they enacted the voter ID law, and then they promptly started shutting down, like satellite DMVs, places where you could easily access your ID, and it became more and more difficult to get to a place where you could actually get an ID. And then, as we all know, you've got to be there between 8:30 and 11:30. Everyone breaks for lunch between 11:30 and 12:30, and then you got to be back before 4 because they close the doors. Like, they just started making it more and more difficult to obtain those government IDs. And I think that's the piece that a lot of people who might support that kind of forget, right?
You're spot on, and it just makes me think back to 2013. Um, Going into the weeds for a minute here because I'm very nerdy in all these topics, but when the Supreme Court ruled in the case Shelby County v. Holder, it was a big voting rights case, and it actually gutted the pre-clearance mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, which basically said, any states that have a history of racist practices, if you're going to change your voting laws, you have to submit them to the Department of Justice for review. So it
Mm.
got rid of that.
Oh,
And
wow.
on that same day of the ruling, Texas basically a law they had passed previously that had been struck down. They moved to get it reinstated the same day that the ruling was made, and within about 2 or 3 weeks after that, North Carolina passed a voter ID law, and they took it to court. People who were against it in the state, voting rights organizations, voters, they took it to court. And throughout the legal process, when they got into the evidence, they found that what the Republican legislators in North Carolina did was they looked at all the types of IDs out there and they got data about which types of IDs that Black residents of their state were least likely to have. And they made those types of IDs the specific ones that were required under the law. And in the judge's ruling, when he struck it down, he said the law targeted Black voters with, the quote was, targeted Black voters with almost surgical precision. So, voter ID, it sounds like a
Wow.
simple
Yeah.
concept. It sounds, hey, it's
Yeah.
fair, you show up, but you got to dig into the details because it can be done in ways that are very unfair.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even with the Save Act, like I know that there are plenty of women, especially on the right, who are saying, "Well, what's the big deal? It's not going to make my life any harder." When in all actuality, when we think about how many women have changed their name after getting married, and I think there's 69 million married women in America that are registered to vote. So like, this is a huge chunk of the population who would have to go an extra step to keep their voter registration intact. And I think that extra step is what people tend to forget and tend to miss, is that there should not be an extra step for any other group in the country. Like, just because white men get to go out and kind of do their thing, like there should not be another step for anyone else. So I think that's a key point that a lot of people forget in this whole kind of scenario. So yeah.
I would agree. And I mean, like there was a leaked recording that came out from one of the Save Act sponsors in the House, Chip Roy from Texas,
Oh
congressman from
yeah.
Texas. And
Hmm.
he acknowledged that his chief of staff, who's a woman, she had to go to her DMV in Virginia multiple times, multiple trips to deal with all the paperwork around getting a real ID. And if you think about that, like multiple trips to DMV, Mallory, to your point, you got to get there in certain hours. If you got kids, you might have to get some kind of
Yeah.
childcare so you can do that. You may have to take time off from work. And
Hmm.
depending on where you live and with rising gas prices, it can cost a lot of money to make multiple trips to the DMV.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Well, I mean, I just had to order a new passport because I got married and changed my last name, which, like, 0 out of 10 recommend. If you're a young woman, just don't do it.
Right. Yeah.
Like, just
keep your
don't do it.
listing.
And that's a $165 process to order a new passport. It's another 30 something dollars in Alabama to get the real ID. It's $30 to get your regular driver's license. And then that's if you have your birth certificate. If you don't, then you've got to call and order that. It's got to be mailed to you. That's $15 to $30. I mean, it's just the tax on anyone trying to vote. And that's really, I mean, above all else, the thing that I've been trying to impress upon people is that it's a poll tax. So whether or not you think it's easy to show up and do those things or not, you shouldn't have to, because they all cost you money. And that's really the big thing. And at the very minimum, I don't know that I'm even on board with voter ID laws, but at the very minimum, if you're going to have a voter ID law, then you need to offer government IDs for free. You need to have easy access. You need to be in communities with, voter ID trucks or whatever you can do in order to make sure that every person who is eligible to vote has an ID to do so. And so the tax element of this is really frustrating. And just anecdotally, my mom, my parents were married and then they got divorced and then they got remarried again many years later. So Mandy's last name changed and then it didn't. And by the time they got remarried, she had gone back to her maiden name and she was like, I'm not changing it again. We're not doing that. She had multiple businesses. She owned a home. She was like, we're not doing that. Smartly. But here recently, she was getting ready to travel, my mom, and she, I guess, needed to update something. And when she got there, come to find out, she had never updated her social security card. So it still said Amanda Hagen, which is our last name, instead of Mandy Moore, which is what she goes by. And so that day, she had to go to 4 different government agencies. She spent 11 hours because she had to travel the next day. She literally had no other choice. She spent 11 hours going back and forth in the local area, dealing with people, getting the rigmarole. It's a joke in our family. Rigmarole.
Roll. Yeah.
Rigmarole.
Sounds right.
She just went back and forth over and over again. And I think that was a privilege, I guess, to have the time, the capacity, the energy to get that done on the day that she needed to. And just how many people will experience that same thing if it's required to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's a textbook example of actually what academics call bureaucratic violence. Back in the early days of voter suppression in the Jim Crow times, and maybe before, maybe like early Reconstruction times or late Reconstruction times, somewhere around that time period, there was literal violence to stop people from voting. People died for this right. But now, that's sort of morphed and changed, and we don't see, like people with guns threatening people at the polls or trying to lynch people, but we see bureaucratic violence.
It's been threatened that ICE will be following us around during election time.
Yeah.
But sorry to interrupt you.
Seen. Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's a good point to make. But I guess I just wanted to say, this is sort of the new form of that, right? Death by 1,000 cuts. I have to do this, this, and this, and this to vote. The rules are changing almost every year, especially in states like Georgia here, where they've changed multiple times in the past couple of years. And it's about making things just less and less convenient, less straightforward, so that, the other aspects of our lives, our kids, our work, our social lives, our responsibilities, we won't find the time to do those sort of time-consuming things to make our voices heard at the ballot box.
Yeah, totally.
When you said, people have died for this, right? I think about that a lot being in Alabama, having run for office in Alabama, especially when I run across young people, as we started this conversation talking about young people who have decided that voting just doesn't matter. And I can understand why they feel that way here, particularly. Doesn't matter, or, it's just not that big of a deal. It really, it like gut punches me, because I look at so many, especially people of color, and I think you have no idea how many people fought for you to have this right. What do you say to people, not just young people, but anyone who doesn't feel like their vote matters right now?
Well, first I'd say I used to be one of those people. When I was in college, early college, I didn't think voting mattered. I thought, all the outcomes were kind of predetermined, and I didn't think it meant much for me to go cast a vote. Then I started learning more about these issues. And so my mother, growing up in Florida, fell in the Medicaid gap. So she made just too much money to not qualify for subsidies, but she didn't really make enough money to pay for healthcare for me and my siblings. My mom was a single mother. And so that got me really interested in learning, why is this happening? What can be done about it? And I found that, politicians in my state had decided that we would not expand Medicaid so that people like my family could not benefit and get health coverage. And, if you look at a lot of the races in the last couple of years, there's tons of examples, but I worked on a race in 2018 in Florida for Nikki Fried, who's the agriculture commissioner. She was the agriculture commissioner there. The race came down to 6,753 votes, and we won. So, races can be decided on very tight margins, and, every vote does matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that here recently with we had a school board election here that was a very big deal and very similar outcome. I mean, it came down to like I think it was less than 1,000 votes that determined that election. And I think in Palm Beach, right? They just had that election with I'm blanking on her name, of course, because pregnancy will make you not remember literally anything in your life. But
Oh, the woman who.
Emil-
Oh, no,
Emily,
go ahead.
is that her name? Yeah, but anyway, she's in the district that covers Mar-a-Lago, and I mean that was a close election. And then
Very.
there was a mayoral race in Florida, I think, that came down to like a
Yes.
couple of votes or something. So I mean, yeah, these elections, it matters to hear about these really tight races because it really does just prove how important a singular vote can be, and maybe even determining how a singular vote can produce those outcomes. So I'm curious from when we talk about voting and talk about elections, and we have these insanely enormous midterms coming up, what do you think Democrats need to do in order to win the younger vote?
Well, I think they need to show that they will be, if they get some power, they will take action to make a tangible difference in people's lives. I think people
Mm,
want to see results. I think people want to see someone who will stand up for them against sort of the corporations and, the billionaires that are kind of morphing slash have morphed into sort of an oligarchy class here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, it's not really like my work that I do, but personally, I feel that the Democratic Party needs to find a way to sort of blend, the economic populism of Elizabeth Warren, the pro-worker policies that we see in the party, and sort of the anti-corporate, anti-oligarch aspect here. Combine that all and stress the freedom to vote to make that happen. And I think we can build a vision that will really mobilize folks to get out there.
Yeah.
yeah. God, where would we be if we had Elizabeth Warren as our president?
Literally anyone.
Yeah,
Yes,
honestly,
Elizabeth, but
anybody.
literally anyone. Max. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. Lots of scary things happening around all of our rights, not just the right to vote. But I think this election cycle, we have such an opportunity to reach those young people and to do what we can to work against the mechanisms that are trying to suppress their vote. So thanks for joining us today to talk about it.
Hey, appreciate the opportunity. It was great talking with y'all.